podcast. I'm Lauren Tocci.
And I'm Ryan Tocci. Remember those posters that said, "Today is the first day of the rest of your life"? Well, that's true of every day, but one. The day you die.
What a happy tone to start us off on.
I mean, if that's just not a microcosm of this entire film.
That is the truth. Well, welcome everyone. We are two people that fell in love at a movie theater and never quite left. We started this podcast to cover the gaps in film knowledge that we have, which is the mission of today with the film we're going to be talking about. But before we get into the film, Ryan, do you have any Tossi's takes for this week? Anything you saw that you liked?
I mean, I loved Coda, but we're going to talk about that over and over during the Oscar episode. But I highly recommend that. You know what? I just wanted to take a couple seconds to talk about the new Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie. Everybody knows from, last season, I am a huge Texas Chainsaw Massacre fan. So every, time a sequel comes out, I get excited and I want something from it. And every time I'm disappointed. And you know what? I'm happy this one didn't disappoint in disappointing me. So Netflix put out a new Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie. It's a direct sequel to the original. Essentially, they're stealing from the playbook of Halloween 2018. Sally was coming back, and it's going to be old Leatherface, and yada, yada, yada. I don't hate this movie by any means. It's a fun and fine enough sequel. If you just sit down and you enjoy it, it's great. If you just took the Texas Chainsaw Massacre name away from it, I actually would have found it to be kind of a fun horror film, just a fun Netflix horror film. But when I try to compare it to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, that's where it loses me. But it was shot fun. There was some, I always hate saying it like this, but some good kills and things like that. So it just doesn't have the depth that the original did. And Tobe Hooper, he made Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2 and essentially turned it into a dark comedy. And I think it's because Hooper knew you couldn't make a sequel to that movie. And ever since, that's all they've been trying to do. And they just want to make these, bloodbath type films, and that's not what the original was. The original had something to say. There was just so much to it, and unfortunately this one just falls short of it. So if you want just a fun, it's an hour and a half, so it doesn't take long.
It's not even. It's an hour and 15 minutes.
Yeah, so for that I give them credit. It's not terrible by any means, but it's certainly not good. But, you want to give me a Tossi's takes, I can't sit here and not talk about a new Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie.
Are you upset that they dropped the and made chainsaw 2 words? So it's Texas Chainsaw Massacre. That's how they differentiate.
Honestly, the thing that just gets me mad is, this whole hype of it was going to be the sequel. Let's hype up Sally coming back and, John Larroquette and all of these types of things from the original. And that's where the movie just loses me. I actually was enjoying myself up until about 2/3 of the film. And then the last third, just the bottom came out. But
that's fair. I mean, here's the thing. It was fine. I was not charmed by it. I think you gave it a lot more grace than I did, but I think that's your love for Leatherface and wanting those films. I mean, you've made me watch every version, except actually Part 2. That's the only one I haven't seen, I think, at this point.
And I have to say, for those that don't know, I hate all the sequels. I don't know if I mentioned that on the original episode. I don't like any of the sequels. It's not like Halloween where I do. So, yeah, I mean...
for my Tossi's takes, I actually saw a horror movie too that I'm excited to talk about, and it's The Batman. If you love the film Seven, you will love The Batman.
Right.
And I don't want to say too much. It's recent. You and I got to see it. AMC was doing 15 different categories of how they were releasing the film. Investor night, whatever that means. So you and I got to see it pretty early in its release, and I was pleased as punch. If you are someone who is thirsting for the DC cinematic universe to have its day, go see this film. It's a 3-hour runtime, though, and it is 3 hours. And I say that not because I was never not engaged in the film, but there's definitely like a portion of it where I was like, okay, but it all pays off. I don't really have anything to critique it. It's a really great Batman film. I'm here for the R-Bats renaissance, but that's all I'll say about the film, assuming that maybe people haven't gotten a chance to see it yet.
Totally with you. I mean, David Fincher made the Batman.
Well, my favorite thing that has come out of this film was the mental crisis you had when I said, well, yeah, Matt Reeves was inspired by Fincher. And you're like, yeah, but how could that be? And then I pointed out that Seven came out almost 30 years ago.
Yeah, we're closer to the 30 years. That's just...
You honestly looked like a robot that had short-circuited.
I mean, I assume last year we had to address that on the episode of how old that movie was, but I don't know. It just, when you said it the other night, it just clicked to me, and it really messed with me a lot.
Here's the credit to Seven. Seven feels very much like a movie that was made in the 90s, but it still looks beautiful in 4K. So because of that, I think it's really easy to forget how long ago it came out.
Yeah.
And it's because it's something you revisit every year. So I think it's always like it feels fresh in your mind and not like something that you've put away for a while. Like other films of the 90s where you might go, well, I haven't watched that in this X amount of years, so I'm not really thinking about the fact that it's like aging. You know what I mean? Like, I think it's like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's just even when you think, I just think Fincher's career, is just kind of blows my mind with the, how long he's been around, because I just don't still see him that way. I mean, even when you think about 1999, which, when he does Fight Club and how old that movie is. We were just talking about that recently, and it kind of, I forget how that movie's over 20 years old at this point. It's just kind of wild to me.
And speaking of 99, we're going to be talking today about a contemporary of that year, that great year in cinema. We're going to be talking today about...
Greatest year ever?
Yeah,
a film.
Well, let's talk later in the episode about that. We're going to be talking about American Beauty. So, essentially the logline for this film is it's a frustrated suburban dad who is coming to terms with a failing marriage, a daughter who is disinterested in him, I guess kind of a sexual awakening, if we want to say that, and absolute and utter frustration with his job. This is a movie that attacks upon the mundane nature of suburban life and also the very fraught nature behind these seemingly perfect neighborhoods. And all that to say, we feel like we have to handle the holdup of this film early. And this movie has multiple holdups. Yeah. As we described in previous episodes, to us, the holdup is, does this film hold up? Does it have anything that would make you not want to watch it? Is it aging poorly, whether because of technology or subject matter or jokes or themes? But this one has some very specific holdups.
I mean, yeah, we were talking about that and why it moves such to the kind of the front end of this episode is because there are some things you just kind of have to address so we can talk about it, get it out, and then kind of move forward with the episode talking about the film analytically. So, I mean, first and foremost, Kevin Spacey. Kevin Spacey has not held up. He was at one point one of the premier actors of all time, and his work is out there and fantastic roles and portrayals. But unfortunately, him as an individual and what has transpired and what has come out, he's hard to watch, especially as your main protagonist.
Well, and I think the thing is like you talk about like Kevin Spacey's like oeuvre like is immense. Like it's hard not to find a movie that he's in that pops up in people's top 10 lists. Right. And obviously for you, Seven's a huge movie. Mm-hmm. And you and I have, talked a lot about where do we place a piece of art when a creator of that art or a central figure of that art becomes problematic to watch comfortably anymore. I know we talked about with Seven of like, well, he's the villain, he's a serial killer. Can that make it feel more
right.
comfortable? I don't know that it does, but if someone says to me, I can't watch American Beauty because Kevin Spacey is in it, and with the crimes that are alleged against him, it makes it hard to watch him in any artistic forum. That makes sense to me, and I respect and honor that.
Yeah, I think these are decisions you almost have to make on a personal level. I think, it kind of comes back to, well, what do you do that puts money back into these people's pockets sometimes plays, those types of decisions. I try to look at, especially a film. A film is a lot of people working together, and should one individual's, horrific past, kind of tear down a lot of other people's, amazing work. So you wrestle with that. So, for this case, we're going to talk about this film, knowing that Kevin Spacey, is a horrible human being, and we're going to kind of put that to the side for right now.
And I think that's why we're doing this at the holdup. At the top of the episode, we're not trying to virtue signal as to how you should feel about this, but almost have to acknowledge, like, people may come to this with particular feelings about watching this work. The other holdup with this is there is an actress in this film, Thora Birch, one of your faves, who was 17 when she filmed this movie. Now, she did this with her parents' consent, but she does show her bare chest in the film. Yeah. And this is one of those things similar to The Godfather of, does this impact how you view the work? Doing a lot of research about Thora Birch and honestly, her parents' involvement, like, at this, like, stage of her career and how they protected her. And there are interviews with Thora Birch where she talks about, like, it felt necessary to that moment. It felt like it had to happen. It makes sense. It didn't feel exploitive. And then her parents were on set for this and consented for this. So there's been a lot documented about this process and why they felt it was significant. But if you're like, hey, I kind of don't want to watch a movie where I know the actress was 17 and she shows her boobs, like, totally get that.
That's very understandable.
I mean, if you didn't know that when you watched that scene and now are like, oh God, I'm sorry, but that is part of this.
Right. And I think, you kind of alluded to it and I agree. There are, Thora Birch has done interviews about this and has no, she feels fine about it. She thinks it was part of the art of the film and doesn't have any ill thoughts about it. So she is comfortable with that. But it certainly doesn't mean it's comfortable when you know that and you're watching it. But obviously, the other holdup of this film is this film's based around, essentially a 42-year-old man trying to have an affair with a 17-year-old girl. So it weaves in with that as well, which doesn't hold up great either.
Why are we doing this episode? Giving this hold up at the beginning, I'm like, why have we even deemed to say that we're going to talk about this film?
Right. I mean, so these are the things. I mean, I don't know if that's a conversation I think that obviously was happening in 99 about this film as well. So I don't think that that's one of these situations that's just like, oh, now we look at it 20 some years later and it goes, oh, that didn't age well. No, that was part of the conversation back then also. And the Thora Birch aspect was controversial at the time as well. Other things that I think, that don't hold up well with this movie is there's some, language that's rough to hear. Now, I think it's purposely used. The way that they, discuss and portray mental health in this film, especially in today's age, does not hold up well. There's a lot to, dissect on that.
And I say this without criticism. It feels very much like a 1999 way of talking about these things.
Yes. And then the other big one that I have a hard time with is the closet gay villain. Like, that's and not to go spoiler here, but I think you're not listening to this if you haven't seen it or don't care. But it just does that. We're going to talk about that character.
He hates gay people because he's secretly repressing. It is a trope that was used to suggest that repression turns to violence, turns to anger, but not in ways that, supported, but this is why we have to have open spaces, but more is just, this shocking plot reveal.
Yes.
And this movie plays right into that hand.
It lands with a thud, especially in 2022. So those would be my holdups. What is that? Did you have any others?
No, I think we've covered it. So I think it's important to say that, the how could you of this is this won Best Picture. The 2000 Academy Awards, of all of the films that came out in 1999, this was awarded Best Picture. You all know I am an Oscar fanatic, so I'm going to say to myself, Lauren, how could you not have seen a Best Picture winner?
Yeah.
Because I only saw this movie recently.
Yeah, only a couple years ago I was shocked when because I've always had my feelings on it. But I didn't really recognize that you hadn't seen it. I just always made an assumption. I thought maybe you were just kind of, your feelings were in the middle on it, and until, maybe about 2 years ago?
No, it was a year ago.
A year ago, yeah, that I finally realized you didn't see it, and we had to have a discussion on whether we were going to watch it or not.
Because of all the aforementioned reasons at the top of the episode.
Right. But it is a good, how could you? You are a huge Oscar fan. I mean, we're going to do a whole episode next time about it. It's Oscar month, as you always call it. So we're choosing to do an Oscar-winning film. And it filled a gap in your film knowledge. But, this is a film that came out during the height of your Oscar love, right? So how did you miss it?
I know that the obvious reasoning here should be this. So I was 14 when this movie came out, 13 when this movie came out. And I know the obvious thing to say here is, well, I was too young to see it, except for the fact that my parents, as I've talked about previously, were not precious about ratings. I don't know how I missed it. I saw the other films, most of them in their time, that were nominated for Best Picture this year. This was one I just didn't see. And I don't remember anyone telling me I couldn't. I just didn't see it, and then just continued to not see it. And not for any bad reasons. Like, before, obviously, the things that we know now, I loved Kevin Spacey, I love Annette Bening, like Thora Birch because of Hocus Pocus, and, Ghost World is always going to have a special place in my heart. But I just hadn't seen it, and it was one of those Best Picture winners that I don't know why I never felt moved to take care of it until you made me watch it.
Well,
and I've never forgiven you.
Well, I think I think it's a good time to address. I don't think anybody's probably going to be shocked by this, but this big reveal, this is a film that I hate it from the moment I saw it.
Okay, so the first time you saw it, immediately you were like, this does not gel with me.
Yes, and now I think it's fair to say that you have not been a fan of it.
So, and this is, if you are someone who is a loyal listener, thank you.
Yeah.
But I think the version of this podcast that you were very used to is us being very excitable, very twee, very gleeful about film.
Right.
This is a notable exception. This is, if you wanted to see like bitter sardonic rage come out of me, you're going to hear it in this episode. I'm going to try and be kind. Look, if you love this movie, love this movie. This is just my 10-cent opinion about something that I saw, and I knew you did not like it. But I thought, I don't know, it's a Best Picture winner. There's got to be something there. But from the moment it started, I went, I'm out. And then I tried, and I thought on repeat viewings, I'd warm to it. I have not.
Yeah, I thought we would have come out of this, and it sounds weird to say, but I thought we were going to come out of this, and this would be one of those movies that, there's not many, but that you and I were polar opposites on. I really thought that I have viewed this film over the years, and a lot that we'll talk about is because this is a strange movie in that it is a Best Picture. I think there are a lot of people that do love this movie. And I always just kind of was curious, did I miss it? Like, do I just not get it? Did I miss it? And it took me a long time that's why I was really happy to sit down and rewatch it with you that time, because I wanted to see it having been removed many years from the first time I had seen it, see it through different eyes, have your kind of, viewpoint on it. And so when the movie ended, I kept waiting for you to really talk highly of it. And when you didn't, it was at least a relief to me. It was also interesting to me because now this was the second time, and I still dislike the film just as much, if not more. I think I do dislike this movie more the more viewings I've had of it. I can promise those who are fans of it that I try every time I watch it to be, find the redeeming qualities of it, find the, an enjoyment in it, but I struggle with it. So yeah, it's an interesting film in that, and I think this is the first time on this show that we are having a film that we both just completely dislike.
Well, and listen, I'm glad for that, because I don't want to go to the mattresses with you about a movie on the podcast. I don't think anybody's ready for that. But in fairness to this movie, I think there is something that's happening in the 90s with film that becomes a really popular examination, and that is the examination of suburban life as something less than perfect. So you have films that come out in the 90s, The Ice Storm, Arlington Road, Happiness, Pleasantville, The Truman Show. I know there's kind of a weird twist on that, obviously. Edward Scissorhands can even fall into this. Waiting to Exhale, Gummo. I know that's a weird one. Of
I
course.
don't know if Gummo's suburban life, though.
Wouldn't you like small town life?
I guess
small
so, yeah.
town suburban maybe.
Arlington Road, though. I'm glad you said that. That's an underrated film.
Yeah. So Fargo, I think, can kind of fall into this too, like a little more desolate small town life. But I think this thing that's happening.
Everybody's pushing small town rural.
What's more vulnerable than a peach? It's always Christmas. So I will say, I think there's this moment that's happening in the 90s where there seems to be this like kind of focus, and I don't know if this is because of like teenage, like kind of counterculture movements, your grunge, and that's like that kind of lead to that. But there's this examination of like the bitter and detached teenager, the parents who are like doing the perfect job, perfect house, perfect yard, but on the inside, everything is like really falling apart. So you have that as like a real through line. So in that way, at the conclusion of this decade, like maybe there's something to American Beauty kind of taking that to its fullest extent where we're really getting inside the head of one of these quote unquote suburban dads. So I think to be fair to this film, maybe we can talk about things we don't hate about it before we get into the things we really don't like about this film. So, Ryan, do you have anything that, like, you don't hate about this film?
Yeah, listen, I do. There's an interesting aspect. You said something there that's really, right now, we're sitting in a time that's starting to peel the layers of the onion back on the mid to late 90s, we're between shows like Impeachment or even Pam and Tommy Lee or Woodstock 99. And then you start to see we look at these films that were coming out in that era. You're right. There seemed to be this cynical kind of edge to everybody. And I think it's interesting, and I think it plays out in, like you said, in these suburban films, the turning of the rock, and there's something underneath it. And it all just was kind of boiling up. But so you talking about that was just interesting to me. No, there are definitely aspects of this film that I don't hate. That's the fun part to analyzing film. I mean, art is what it is. Like it's beauty is in the eye of the beholder is a cliche for a reason because it's true. Like we're going to talk about all the reasons we dislike this movie, but anybody that loves it, love it. Like I'm sure that there's things that you're just going to really, so I'm not taking that away. And this movie to me, some of the things that really stand out are Thomas Newman's score to me is really outstanding.
Yes. Yeah.
It becomes iconic. Most people that are film lovers can hear that and instantly know what film that's coming out of. And I think I really appreciate how it plays throughout the film and really, although, we're going to talk about the reasons we don't love necessarily the themes of the movie, it helps to really balance the movie out and ping pong it through. So I really appreciate that. Character of Ricky, over the years, I have actually I went from disliking to cynical about myself to now I'm starting to actually like over the years. Actually, when you were talking about the reasons you didn't see this movie, I was like, she had to be like in that Wes Bentley, on the wall.
Oh yeah, I'll get there.
Ricky, though, like I don't mean to go right off the bat, but Ricky probably holds up the best in this movie. I mean, my man was an icon in, like, he was rocking the beanie, all the time.
He's the original hipster.
He's the original hipster. Ricky was ahead of the curve on filming everything. To nauseam, like, so that there's I think there's some interesting stuff to Ricky in a different, if it was handled a little bit differently, if everything around it, I think that character could be really interesting. I think there are some aspects of it that fall flat, but overall I can see, some appeal there and some interesting stuff going on. But I also just like Mendes' shooting style. I like what he can do. We're going to talk about his filmography later, but he creates a movie here that I think I hate, I dislike, but I'm also comfortable watching for 2 hours. Yeah. I'm not in this, like, please let this be over. Like, there are a lot of eye rolls that I have. There's a lot of snarky comments I want to make, especially the more I watch it. But he also lets me sit in this and I enjoy visually what he's doing, the way he's framing everything. So there is something about the way that he directs that I appreciate. A lot of his films, but we'll get to that. But that would be my top.
I think those are fair. It's funny you say the Wes Bentley thing, because, 100%. But, Wes Bentley looks like he's going to eat Thora Birch at different parts of this film. His eye, it's a real intense eye contact. He should have played a vampire. He should have started Twilight.
I think there was, not long after this, he played, a vampire demon type role.
I think we're gonna need to go to Blockbuster and rent that. So there's the Wes Bentley. The things I don't hate Annette Bening's performance. Here's the thing. Because in my top 3 things I hate, there's going to be another twist to this, but this is what I'll say. Annette Bening said that she feels like acting, most people refer to it as putting a mask on, but she said that acting is actually taking the mask off. Mm-hmm. And I think there are moments in this where she lets us into a person who has decided for themselves that they are the one who's doing everything, but doesn't understand how the reason that no one is helping them is because they're tearing down relationships around them by announcing that they do everything. There are things she does that I'm like, all right, that's fair. Not in every scene. I think there's a lot of over the top, and I'll get there, and I think that's has to do with what my biggest hate of this film is. But at that, I think there are some interesting things there. I think I completely agree with you. Sam Mendes frames certain shots in this film that I'm like, I think is what keeps me hanging on. Yeah. And I think kept me hopeful that on rewatches I would feel differently. Because there's this wonderful way in which he frames living rooms and dining rooms that feel like the way in which everything in suburban life is supposed to be kept in perfect balance. And he does it without it really announcing itself. I don't think a lot of the film does that. I think a lot of the film really announces what it's trying to do, but I think his framing doesn't. And it's the subtlety of that I wish there had been more of in all aspects of the filmmaking. But I will say, he's incredibly talented, and there are a lot of his films that I really love and respect and admire. And I think something that keeps me holding on is that. The other thing that I really love is when Kevin Spacey says, "The car I always wanted, and now I have it. I rule."
I rule. Yes.
It's just about the only line in the movie that I laugh at.
Yes. You literally wrote that down too. I'm totally with you. That is the best line of the entire movie.
It's the most Kevin Spaceyest moment of acting, and it's so natural, and it's the one time where I'm like, you know what, man, good for you. Quit your job. Go after that 17-year-old. I support your decisions. But only literally for that sentence. And then I'm back to going, I hate this dude so much. Those are the things that I like, or that I don't hate. And I think if anyone says, well, don't, you have to give credit to the directing, yeah, 100%. I'm not gonna argue the opposition on that. But I think that's kind of where my love for the film stops, unfortunately, because I think, and this is where we get into talking about the top 3 things we hate about this film, and why we have to take it down to top 3 is because there'd be so many things.
I do want to say, Wes Bentley, by the way, I was getting confused. It was Soul Survivors that he had done 2 years after American Beauty, and then I'm also getting confused with the character that he plays in Ghost Rider. So,
because he plays a demon in Ghost Rider. I just it's his well coiffed facial hair in Hunger Games that to me is the lingering Wes Bentley impression I have. But yeah, I do agree with you. There is something about that character that's like really interesting. Actually, I'm sorry. That's a bonus thing I don't hate about this movie. I mean, I'm here for a found footage.
Right. Yeah.
I'm here for the intercutting of that. I think there's something interesting. I think the problem, though, is the first 10 seconds of this film delivers a natural born killers vibe that the movie never completely finds that I was hoping it would. And when you're wishing for the plot line of natural born killers, you're really not enjoying a movie.
I'm happy you talk about that because there's something, and if we want, we can either wait and talk about it later or we can talk about it right now, but Do you know that there's supposed to be a different ending to this movie?
I didn't know that, but let's talk about it now.
Okay, so, and I want to know your opinion if it changes the movie, and and it's all based around what you're talking about, the start of this film.
Oh, okay.
So this film actually is supposed to, and it was written in the script, and they actually shot it. I don't believe the filming of it has ever, come out, so I don't think there's anywhere to find it, but it's supposed to end with Jane and Ricky actually on trial. And it gets played out into the media because all of their videos that they shot, especially that framework of the front end, that's supposed to kind of essentially show their guilt before, and they end up getting convicted. So they go through the trial and they end up getting convicted and going to jail. So it's a much different ending.
In that version, are they the ones who kill him?
They are not. No. It's still the same ending, but because of the videos, because of who Ricky is, because,
the
all
most
of that
relatable drug dealer that has ever existed.
Right. But then again, we're talking about that mental health stuff because he was in, a hospital, and then he has these films of her telling him to kill her dad, because that's the important part of that is they turn off the film when she says, "I'm not serious," right? So the film would only have had that. And so it gets played out into the media, and they're kind of convicted. I personally, I'm not saying it saves this movie. I would have preferred that ending, because what I think one of my biggest issues with this movie is they change the point of view. This movie decides that it's going to take place around Lester, and that's why they end up kind of bookending then from there his narration to end his narration. Alan Ball says, "I'm glad they didn't because that would have been too cynical," which I just thought. So Alan Ball, who's the writer of this film, I'm like, are you kidding me? Your whole film is cynical. He said it was too bleak of an ending. I'm like, how do you, no way you ended this film without being bleak.
Dude, you have someone say about their spouse, "I get exhausted just watching her." The movie's bleak, dude.
Right. So I gotta ask you, just knowing that, do you... listen, I'm not saying it saves it, but do you think it would have been a better ending?
No. I'm sorry. Let me go back. I think if this ends in a space with that, I think then the criticism becomes something that signals, be careful, youth, all the things you record, they could be used against you, which feels a little forward thinking for 99 in terms of predicting what's going to happen next with technology. So in that way, that's kind of interesting. I think the trial, though, to think, actually, I'm going to roll this back. It actually makes a lot of sense. You do have a lot of Dateline stories in the 90s and early 2000s of plots between couples to kill the one's parents because they can't be together. Yeah. You have that happening a lot. I think it preys upon that and then adds this weird and very ominous question of but what if it wasn't them, but they're being accused because all of the evidence seems to suggest. There's something there, but I don't know if they pull that off in a way that feels as intentional as maybe you and I are talking about it. I don't say that we're talking some high intellectual art that people can't perceive. I'm saying that in the seeing the rest of the structure of this film, it makes me leery that they would have pulled that off in any type of cogent way where you would have gotten that thematic from it.
I'm a little concerned that Alan Ball seems to believe that this film ends on a more positive note.
Well, because Lester is talking to us from heaven, I think. Right. That's what I'm to...
What's your feelings on dead narrators?
When Sunset Boulevard did it, it was a triumph, and then everyone else since, you are stealing and not being successful with it.
I know, because we've talked about it on this show before, about your feelings on narrators, and you said it's hit or miss, right? It depends on how it's used.
Yeah,
You're not completely against it like some people, but you just, again, dead narrators are a little bit harder to
and listen, when you're
get behind.
When your dead narrator's William Holden, I'm, 75% more bought in because of that, but in Sunset Boulevard, the way that's used is to add to the mystery and the noir nature of the film, and it's a very interesting tactic to have us kind of in his perspective of this broken nature of what you expect Hollywood to be. I think this film could have gotten to all of the bitter, seething, angsty male rage of the 90s in Lester without the narration, because everything he does in the film already shows that without needing that. But as we're kind of starting to list things, do you want to go back and forth one by one with our top 3 things we hate about the film? Do you just want to do your list and then I'll do mine?
Yeah, we'll go back and forth. Why don't you throw out one first?
All right, so there's so many. My number 1 has a bullet, but
no pun intended?
No pun intended. My third thing I hate most about this film is...
It's the most awkward list we're going to give.
Yes. Is how pleased it is with itself.
Oh, God, right?
And I think, so the comment I had just made, and I think this is really at the heart of it. So obviously you brought up really nicely that there is a discussion happening about 90s film and 90s pop culture in general, and the discussion of kind of this disenfranchised, gendered male angst and rage that's kind of like seething in this decade, with no real cause behind it, but just it being there. And I think this film is like, whoops, we're going to tackle that in the suburbs, folks. And there's a real sense to me of this film thinking or knowing it's the smartest film in the room, and it's not, but it feels that. And I think the problem is I don't like a film that announces itself as profound. Let it be profound. You know, they talk about so much like in writing, like show don't tell. Well, filmmaking, it's the same thing, you know, and this film, and I think some of that is narration, but I think this is also a movie that I imagine audiences sat and thought to themselves like, oh, this is filmmaking, something interesting. Yes, let's get into this grime of being suburban and having to work for corporate sleaze America. But the problem is the film says it so deliberately. There's no craft in the message. There's nothing hidden about the message. And I think the overt nature at which it tries to criticize these things and how happy it is that it's doing this and how much it tries to tell me that I am to celebrate that it's doing this, it just fails in that quest.
Yeah, I mean, it's cynicism of suburbia is just a little played out and unnecessary, and I totally behind everything you're saying. And
I grew up in the burbs. I don't remember it being this fraught.
That's the thing. So this film...
And I'm not saying the burbs settled themselves from the late 90s to the early 2000s, and I don't think that it's not without, looking at these quote-unquote nuclear families and thinking there's some stuff to be mined there, but there's got to be some craft with it. Ice Storm, I think, is a really great example of this from the 90s that did it with some sense of, we're not going to beat you over the head with it, but there's a lot of stuff here. And it's a credit to Ang Lee.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, Ang Lee. And listen, I mean, we've talked about with Mendes, I mean, he ends up doing Revolutionary Road, which is essentially the same, concept of this.
But the 50s.
Right. So, yeah, I don't know, this, woe is the, white suburban rich family is a little hard to get behind. It's just hard to feel this sympathetic feelings for this upper class burden, right, that they're trying to portray here. This need to not be ordinary and to feel purpose. This whole film is based around the thorns on the rose. I mean, it's like you said, it's hammering home. And listen, we were going to kind of do this top 3 hates. I'm going to throw that out. Right? We've had this whole thing because, that's pretty much my number 1 is what you're saying, right? So, we could just discuss this film without trying to break it down into these. Everybody that's listening now knows where we feel about it. It's, just some of the things to me, it kind of plays with exactly what you're saying. You hit the nail on the head. This movie is very pleased with itself. I wrote it in my notes. I'm so glad that you said it. And it's all the way down to its really pretentious dialogue. It's clunky, and you have a cast of very notable actors who have an absolutely hard time delivering any of these lines, and it turns into just overacting on overacting.
I'm really glad you said that, because back when we were doing a top 3, my number 1 with a bullet, pun very much intended, was, So this is how Alan Ball fetishizes that teenage girls talk.
Oh, yes.
Because his handling of Angela, played by Mina Savari, makes me want to lash out irrationally. Because that whole sequence where he writes about how she knows since she was 12 years old that men were checking her out, and Jane reacts like, ew, and she's like, no, I like it. I'm like, who's writing this?
Do you know Alan Ball is on record of saying that he took this dialogue, how teenage girls talk, from being at a U2 concert. From the girls that were sitting in front of him at the concert, and one yelling out, Edge, I want you to have 10,000 of my babies, right? Like, this is... No, I'm with you.
Okay, because here's the thing. I have been a teenage girl who was obsessed with U2, and I may have yelled that at various concerts, but let me tell you, by no means was I ever like... Look, because here's the thing. The playfulness of the over-sexualized way that we sometimes talk about desire as teenagers or as grown adults is fun. But to say that as a young person that you would be like, yeah, I kind of liked it when those older guys looked at me. I'm like, no one says that. This is so false. This is a way in which you can tell 100% that an older male wrote these female parts. And it really shows, too, within the character that Annette Bening plays, Carolyn Burnham, because what we see with her is there's no other way of describing her. She's shrill. And to me, there is a real sense of, I want to write her as shrill as possible. Like, you can almost like hear it probably as he was typing it out. And that word becomes incredibly charged as thrown at women, particularly women who are balancing like a lot of different identities, mother, working, like human being, like, so you have these various things that are at play that could have been dealt with in a very real and concerted way of talking about the ways in which like there are imbalances in relationships, there are imbalances in parenting, that could have been really refined, except that you obviously have someone who does not know how to write female characters. He went to the Ernest Hemingway School of Writing Females, and it shows.
Yeah, some of the dialogue between Jane and Angela are probably the worst of the entire film. I think a lot of it is really bad.
Yes.
Because I have to say, I think the Annette Bening in most of her scenes, I find really, off-putting. Obviously, a lot of the stuff between Chris Cooper and Wes Bentley, but the stuff with Thora Birch and Mina Savari are just awful, and they're not well delivered lines either. Like, they're not helping it. So
no.
It's difficult to watch. It becomes as cringeworthy as the final scene between Kevin Spacey, between Lester and Angela, which is maybe one of the most cringeworthy scenes ever put on film. But this dialogue is close second.
Yeah, because and the scene that you're talking about on the couch, I think what I find so offensive about that moment is that the thing that stops him is because she's not an experienced woman. He assumed that she is someone who has had sex before, and that's the only thing that stops him from having sex with a 17-year-old girl. Oh, wait, you're not experienced? Oh, well, then this is wrong. Because I must keep you perfect and pure just the way you are.
And here's my question, and everybody's going to have their opinion on it, is... This film, what is it trying to say about Lester? I've seen this film now a variety of times, and I still don't know, is Lester considered our hero? I get it, it's a male fantasy of making a man going through his midlife crisis and these decisions that he's making. But he's just horrible. That's the thing. He is just horrible. And then I watched that ending, and you almost get this, oh, we're redeeming him. And then he gets to have almost this feeling of, inner peace and...
Proud dad.
Yeah. It's just weird. I don't get it. And that's a big issue I have... At the time I saw this movie and all the praise that was coming about it was you hear all these people oh, that movie's so real, it's so true, and I'm just I don't know. I'm a glass half full guy. I don't see the world this cynical, with this much cynicism. I can't get behind Lester. I can't get behind any of these characters, which is also another huge problem with this movie. a movie like this needs to have an anchor of a character that you care about, that you like, but not one of these characters are likable.
I feel really bad for Jim and Jim that these are their neighbors.
Thank you. Yes, Scott Bakula and his partner are by far the only two characters that I care about.
Well, and going back to what you're saying about that ending sequence, like with him in the kitchen and this kind of like redemption moment, is like, it's also the way in which they told Mina Savari to like act that scene. Like the way in which she carries herself the entire film is like very desirous. There's like a desire in her eyes, and they have her do this like very doe-eyed thing. And then he has this like sensitive moment which he talks about his daughter with her, as though now finally talking to her in the way he should have been, which is like, this is my daughter's friend. And I think the problem I have with this is I think the film positions him to be heroic and redemptive and sympathetic. Like, guys, haven't you all felt this way? Haven't you looked at a young girl? Haven't you felt frustrated with your job? Haven't you thought about cheating on your wife? And there's a real sense of that, like, logline throughout the film. And I think the problem with that is that someone might be like, no, it's really criticizing all those things. And the only thing I want to ask you is, do you think it's that Jordan Belfort is also being criticized in Wolf of Wall Street? Because I have to think then you look at these things the same. He is positioned as heroic. We get him beatific as he dies. He's smiling, almost like as though this is the thing he wanted to have happen. He wanted to get in shape so he can have this moment. He's the one who decides to not let this relationship come to fruition. And then he gets to talk to us from the beyond, some way lifted up higher than any of the characters in the film. And then we end with everyone having to react to his death and this like crisis moment for like, Caroline, where she's like devastated and clinging to his shirts like, okay, he did have meaning and purpose and that people did love him. I find the ending of this film incredibly grotesque, and I think it would be hard for anyone to convince me that you're not supposed to position him as the hero of this film.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think it's definitely saying that, and that to me is kind of the worst. We were talking a lot about Angela, so that actually was offered to Kirsten Dunst first. We're talking about Oscars. She's up for an Oscar this year. She actually turned it down because of what the role was. She was 15 at the time and said she was not going to be in a movie where she's kissing Kevin Spacey. I think Sarah Michelle Gellar also turned the role down, very similar reasons. And I believe Brittany Murphy was also in the running. Do you think the film's aided by any of those actors, if they're in that role?
No, because I think the problem is, and I think the central thing that I take umbrage with this film is the writing.
Yeah.
And I think you can't solve that. There's something about this writing that feels stunted, with a lack of depth, with a real surface understanding of the themes that it's trying to say it's approaching. And then also in a way that, like, to me almost reads like portraying suburban life like a really cheesy PSA from the 50s about like angel dust. Like it doesn't, we always make the joke, there's this like fake PSA in a comedy that we like where it's like this guy going, I have a baby 'cause of Prague. Right. The entirety of this dialogue reads to me like that. And it's strange, like what was on page and how it was performed. And I don't know if the direction was somewhat for it to be that. There's something stiff and robotic about the suburbs, but I don't think it delivers in a way. Like, and you have that moment when Jane is going to leave with Ricky and she's in an argument, and Jane said, like, because Angela yells, Jane, he's a freak. And Jane says back, well, then so am I. And we'll always be freaks and never be like other people. And you'll never be a freak because you're too perfect. Yeah, well, at least I'm not ugly. And then Ricky says, yes, you are. And you're boring. And you're totally ordinary. And you know it. What is the thing? Yeah, thank you. I'll be accepting my Oscar any day now. But I think that's, to me, that encapsulates what's wrong with this film. It didn't know how to write any of the ages of its characters, but feels like the perspective of Lester writing the story. And at one point I was like, okay, is the purpose that Lester's recounting this and this is to him how the dialogue sounds? But I don't think the film's doing that. No. I think that's me trying to justify the dialogue.
I don't think so. I think it was a decision later to change your point of view from what we understand about what the ending was supposed to be, to put Lester as your main focus. There's two things here I want to say. So, and they're very different. So, the movie's trying to, its overarching theme, I want to appreciate, right? Which is this just gratitude of life. You're all going to die, so live it and appreciate it, right? That's your central theme of what we're trying to get at. And I love that. I appreciate that. The problem is, all of that, again, is sprung from a man who's having a midlife crisis and only decides to live life because he becomes infatuated with an underage girl. It's hard to, at any point, really process that. I don't know or get behind that. It just really does a disservice to its own message. The other thing that you were talking about a lot with, you gave this great reading of some terrible dialogue.
You're welcome.
And yes, anybody that knows me personally knows that I am a big champion of Thora Birch. But
homeless to Harvard.
I'm trying to figure out why. I'm starting to think I wasn't a big fan of Thora Birch. I'm starting to think that I was just a big fan of Enid from Ghost World.
Well, take my hand.
Yeah.
You're just realizing that now?
So, she was also great in The Hole, but that's a whole... But no, all seriousness, though, that's another issue I have with this movie. You had to... The Angela and Jane relationship makes absolutely no sense to me. Your position in Jane as this kind of what we would call emo, grungy girl... Her being on the cheerleading squad doesn't make a lot of sense to me. She seems so out of place there. Her relationship with Angela doesn't make any sense. And to me, it's all just so we can get Angela to the house, right? Like, we need to get Angela to Lester. And so you wanted to write this character and you wanted to write this character. You didn't know how to get either of them to where they needed to be. So let's just put them together, even though they make no sense together. And unfortunately, there's no chemistry of friendship with these two.
Because you think, like, Alan Ball's writing is like, no, like, definitely the daughter should be depressed. But I also want a horny cheerleader. Yeah, it's definitely got to be a horny cheerleader. Like, that's essentially what I feel like was in his nose.
Do you, what's your feelings on the Ricky and Jane relationship?
Contrived.
Yes.
What I hate about it is our introduction to their relationship is on the heels of Angela's comments about how she likes men leering at her, and then Thora Birch goes in the house after yelling at Ricky for filming her, but you can tell she's kind of pleased that he did, and I feel like, so you think women want to be stalked and filmed against their will, don't you, Alan Ball? Because that's all I'm getting from this.
Yeah, that should have probably been our hold-up as well.
Stalking
Yeah, exactly. It does not hold up well. I laughed because Alan Ball said this film was inspired, or the writing this was inspired by the Amy Fisher, Joey Buttafuoco story. That essentially he saw a comic that was on one side, essentially kind of talking from Joey Buttafuoco's side, and one was from Amy Fisher's side, and he was like, yeah, it's somewhere in the middle, and that's how he gets inspired to write this.
I really wish we recorded this, like, on film so people can see the face I just made. I'm not shocked.
Jane was the role was actually originally offered to Jessica Biel. She ended up not being able to do it because of Seventh Heaven at the time. Again, think it's any better?
No. Here's the thing. I don't think this is on the cast. I really don't. I'm not blaming the cast here. I think there is poor writing. I think there was a point of view issue. I think changing the ending obviously made them confused about the perspective of this film. No, I don't think that this is a fault of the cast. I think this is a fault. I really say the fault lies in the writing.
Do you know who was offered originally the role of Lester?
Who?
Tom Hanks.
I would have hated that so much. Because I would have had to figure out a way to love this movie because I'm ride or die for Tom Hanks.
Yeah, it makes sense because he obviously, Mendes really wanted to work with Tom Hanks because I think his next film is Road to Perdition, and then he gets Tom Hanks in a more different type of role.
Yeah, darker. Yeah, like a little more villainous.
I'm with you. I absolutely can't see Tom Hanks in this role at all, nor do I want to.
And it's funny you should bring up Tom Hanks because he's an Oscars darling, and we've got to talk about this in the context of the Best Picture race that year. So this wins. It was nominated alongside The Insider, Cider House Rules, The Green Mile, and The Sixth Sense. So obviously neither of us would have given it to American Beauty. I'm going to ask, which would you have given it to over American Beauty?
You
can't say any. You have to pick one.
Well, yeah, that's a weird list. There's no way that those were the 5 best films of that year.
No, and we'll get there.
Yeah, absolutely no way. And I love The Green Mile and The Sixth Sense, so I would absolutely pick The Sixth Sense over this in a heartbeat. I would actually pick probably all 4. The only one is, The Cider House Rules. I just watched it again the other day.
But let's explain the circumstances. We were in a hotel room with limited cable, and it was like the only thing that was on.
Like, I get what the appeal, but at the same token, it's one of those movies that just doesn't really last. That's a very strange that those are the 5 films. The Green Mile I love, but I understand recently watching some stuff that maybe that film's not holding up in its own right. But to me, The Sixth Sense, it's just a really, and listen, we're huge M. Night fans here.
Yeah.
So I know a lot of people have their feelings about it, but that movie was a, pop culture, significant film, and it was a groundbreaking film in its own right, and it holds up today. So I have to say, if I have to only choose between those 5, I'm going The Sixth Sense.
Yeah, same. My answer is the exact same. So I really like the insider political thrillers are always fun. 90s political thrillers especially. And I liked Russell Crowe, that section of his career.
He had a really good part of that career right in that time period.
Yeah, there's like a set of like 5 to 10 years there where like he's like, it's, great film after great film.
Yeah.
Cider House Rules, I think has a really beautiful performance by Michael Caine, and I'm a sucker for anything like kind of World War II era fashions. The fall in New England, come on, that's like my exact fall 1940s New England is my exact aesthetic. But no, 100%. I think The Sixth Sense, it was a cultural phenomenon, and I think it's such a brilliantly crafted film. M. Night Shyamalan has a way of building tension. He has a real understanding, I think, a lot like we've talked about with like Mike Flanagan of Bill, balancing that horror films can also come from places of like intense love and grief and hope, and those things can be really like baked into a horror film, and he does this with The Sixth Sense. I don't know why it doesn't win, except for the fact that the Academy hates horror films, and I think anything deemed as such, although I think The Sixth Sense is more than that. They just will not get behind, but it's also a weird year in terms of the other films that come out this year too.
Yeah, when we talk about these 5, I kind of see how this film ends up winning in its own right. Like, I mean, we're not going to get all into that right now, but it plays to the Academy voting base, especially at that time, completely. Your producer Spielberg. I
don't want to talk about that aspect.
He buys Alan Ball's, script. He actually handpicked Sam Mendes to direct it because of he saw his production of Oliver and then sees his production of Cabaret in London.
Amazing.
Which, you and I had we got to see the Broadway production of Sam Mendes' Cabaret, which was phenomenal.
Exquisite.
So I see where he comes from. I get now when I look at that 5 how it ends up winning. I don't understand how that's the best 5 that year, but...
And I'll say, there's a few other races that they win in that I'm still kind of confused by. Best actor. I don't know how you don't give this to Denzel Washington for The Hurricane.
Absolutely. Not even, it shouldn't even be a question.
No, best cinematography. You're not going to tell me that this had better cinematography than Sleepy Hollow. I won't hear it. Then
the Sleep... horror films not going to win.
I know, but I'm just saying, like...
No, I agree with you.
Best writing, are you telling me really this was better written than Magnolia being John Malkovich and The Sixth Sense?
I went on a rage in 2000 when being John Malkovich did not win.
I believe it.
Nobody will ever tell me that was not the best written script, the most original written script that anybody has ever seen. Just absolute perfection. And the fact that you're right, the fact that this wins over that is just bothers me more than the fact that it won Best Picture.
And I can understand that, because being John Malkovich was so incredibly innovative, and then... to me, though, and this is legitimately... I think
being John Malkovich wins today.
Oh, without a doubt. Yeah. Being John Malkovich comes out today, that is the Oscar darling, wins in a heartbeat.
They've started to change on that writing category, that's where they award these little more, unique films.
Yeah, but this is legitimately what I wrote in my notes. Best director, this aggression will not stand. How did Spike Jonze not win?
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know. And like, obviously we love M. Night, so I would have given it to M. Night too. But I will say, I don't know how you tell me that Spike Jonze doesn't deserve this for being John Malkovich.
Yeah. Who else was nominated?
So that was Lasse Hellstrom for The Cider House Rules, and then Michael Mann for The Insider.
They really love The Cider House Rules that year, huh?
Like, really shocked. Because I'm going to tell you, how I saw The Cider House Rules, it was a $5 DVD in that big Walmart bin where you just got to like grab down and pull. Like, that's how I watched it. So I'm very surprised how much...
I can also tell you a director that's not in there that should be in there.
Okay, so all right, so you can kind of spearhead that portion of the conversation. We have talked on this podcast endlessly. Honestly, I think our whole podcast could be about 1999. The films that came out that year that should have obviously been in this conversation or obviously should be more well regarded than something like American Beauty. So who is that director you would have thrown into that race?
David Fincher for Fight Club.
100%.
Yeah, I mean, the innovation and the style that he brought. I mean, I understand that it was not a film that the Oscars would kind of cling to, but to me, it's by far the best piece of film directed that year. Maybe followed by M. Night with The Sixth Sense.
Or PTA with Magnolia.
Yes.
Like, and I think this is like the really interesting thing. You talked about this with being John Malkovich. Like, in this Oscars like climate now, that wins a best screenplay, best original screenplay. I think Fight Club is more in the conversation now than when it came out. I think if Fight Club comes out now, I think it has a very interesting hit. But also the hard thing is Fight Club is capturing that exact thing we've been talking about, that this film, that American Beauty mishandles. It's capturing that so much more authentically, even in the most absurdist way. Credit obviously to Chuck Palahniuk's novel that this is based on, but it captures it, I think, more authentically or more viscerally than this does. Definitely with more craft. So maybe that subject matter wouldn't be so lauded now. Right. But in 99, it's hard to think of, like, how are you not seeing this as really being the thing with the pulse on the cultural movements?
Speaking to the choir here, you said about it being nominated this year. I think the clout of Fincher now gets it nominated. I don't think he had the clout that he did then. It's kind of like Paul Thomas Anderson, Fincher, Nolan, some of these directors at this point. It's like the Oscars are... always wants to reward them in a nomination, but not reward them in an actual statue. And it seems to be every year we know that if they put something out, they're going to be in the conversation. But it doesn't seem to yet want to take the leap to award any of these guys.
Can I tell you, I thought you were going to say something different for director for this.
What were you thinking?
I thought you were going to say, why wasn't Stanley Kubrick nominated for Eyes Wide Shut?
Yeah.
Now, granted, it would have been a posthumous Oscar, but, how is that not?
Yeah.
Do you think subject matter? Do you think it's too...
That's
more scandalous than the...
It didn't get well received. It
Shocking
was
to me,
terribly received at the time. I think it's a film that Oscars, scholars can look back on and look at it. I think there was a niche audience of us that loved it at the time and still love it today, but I think it's something that gets looked at more favorably today of his works. I mean... Kubrick obviously was always completely shunned, for everything he did. The fact that he didn't win for 2001 is still a travesty. The fact that he didn't have an Oscar is a travesty. Because he's probably the greatest, to me, he's the greatest director of all time. And I think Eyes Wide Shut should have been a Best Picture nominated film.
Well, talk about a film that actually deals, again, in an absurdist way, but more authentically with the dissolution of a marriage of a wealthy, should be seemingly incredibly happy couple. I mean, you're the two most gorgeous individuals in the world. How are you not so pleased with each other? And yeah, there's and it almost it handles the midlife crisis better and the notion of desire and this quiet rage and this quiet desperation that is baked into so much of 90s society and male identity. And Eyes Wide Shut does it better. because it's not beating you over the head. It's there, but you have to uncover it. It's not being thrust upon you with every narration.
Yeah, and you went back to, you said at the beginning, it doesn't get in the conversation because no one at that time was able to look past the orgy scene. I mean, that's what the film, it got this stigma behind it, and...
There's an orgy, but, there's so much more than it.
No, exactly. I mean, you have to be able to look past these things and see what, the filmmaker is trying to say with it, and not just be so scandalized by it. And I think what you talked about, it's a really great point that I don't think I would have thought off the cuff, but it's a great, film to really compare it to the movie we're talking about today, because it does give you a lot more. And I think we talked about it. It's characters. Your hero, your protagonist isn't just he's got despicable qualities, but he's not completely unredeemable.
He's not morally bankrupt. And I think the thing is what does this say about sexual politics in 1999, that the film that won Best Picture is the one where a 42-year-old man is desirous of an underage girl, but the film that doesn't get nominated is where consenting adults are being liberal with their bodies at a party.
Jeez. Yeah, I mean, not really sure where to go from that, but I mean, you're not wrong.
Well, why don't we just talk about Sam Mendes then?
Yeah, that's a good way to move forward. I mean, obviously building quite the resume now over the last 20-some years. Not a ton of films, but significant films for sure.
Sure.
Do you, he's a very interesting director because I think he's probably a phenomenal, stage director, which is obvious. And
it's obvious in how he polices his films, where the camera is in relation to the actors.
His filmography is not something I appreciate Sam Mendes as a director very much. He doesn't have a filmography on the most part that is really my cup of tea, other than 2 films.
Okay, well, so I think we have the same 2, because there's absolutely no way that we don't, but I'm curious which one you would go with first.
So, kind of, Road to Perdition I actually appreciate a lot. I don't know if that's a movie that's a lot of people, it seems to kind of disappearing over time a little bit.
Yeah. And I love that film.
I really loved it. Jarhead, I think, is really trying to say something. Really good film. I think that was a film that just people didn't understand what they were going to see. And I think that's...
And that was a failure on the marketing.
Yes.
That movie got marketed way different than what it actually was.
So those are Revolutionary Road to me. I hate.
It gave us Michael Shannon, so you've got to be a little okay with it.
There's your redeemable. That's what makes it better than American Beauty to me, is the 5-minute section of Michael Shannon. You are a big Bond fan, so he does Skyfall and Spectre. So obviously he's very, if you're a Bond fan, you're going to probably really love him.
Yeah, and I don't love those films. So I love Casino Royale, but Skyfall and Spectre were not like Skyfall, but Spectre I didn't attach to it.
But the 2 that obviously rise to the top for you and me, there's no way. 1917 is just a marvelous piece of filmmaking. I don't care what anybody says. They're going to talk about it. A lot of people have a problem with it. They say it's gimmicky because it, kind of plays as a one shot. It's not one shot, but it plays out like a one shot.
You know what I would say? Your mom's gimmicky.
We're at that point.
We've said orgy 15 times. We're at your mom is gimmicky.
But no, as I tried, 1917 is if you want to try to rank it in war films, to me is probably my favorite war film of all time.
Okay, I can back that.
It is just like I said, it's a marvelous piece of filmmaking. I don't care what anybody says. I love that movie. Do you feel similarly?
I feel incredibly the same. I wouldn't say it's my favorite war film. I think Saving Private Ryan still takes my top spot.
Understandable.
But it's definitely up there, and I'd say it's 100% in the top 5, and it's probably in my top 3 of all time. I just remember watching that and marveling at it. I didn't care about the one-shot aspects of it. I cared about the cinematography, how the characters were built, the kind of this like passing of the torch, this like seemingly like very small component of a much larger narrative that is war. It really worked to me as a way in which to kind of give a snapshot. It felt very inside.
Agreed. Completely.
So I think it doesn't get enough credit because I think people got hung up on that one aspect of it and felt like that was the only thing that could be there. And I feel like if you take the time to rewatch the film, you'll see it is more than that. But that is still an achievement that we shouldn't just pass off as though it's nothing, because it is incredible. Because I think the idea is like we are participating in viewing this in almost like a first person point of view, as though you are with them as they're going through. It's, I think, without exactly doing this, it's making it almost like you're a part of the film. And I think that's something really interesting to do, particularly with a war film, because that can be so jarring. And I think he does that nicely.
Yeah, the whole gimmicky aspect of it, to me, I think it just does a disservice to it, because you have two other films that come out near that time that one could argue are also gimmicky, and to both varying degrees. You have Boyhood, which just doesn't have any depth to us. Like, there's no real heart there. There's no real, the way that, they end up choosing to shoot that and everything. It's interesting. It's a neat piece of filmmaking, but to me, it feels like the gimmick. Then you have Gravity, which I absolutely love, but it doesn't have a lot of sustainability because outside of this remarkable visual aspect of it doesn't, again, it kind of lacks a little depth. But to me, this film has a lot of story going on it. It has surprise. It has tension. I care about the main characters. I care about the people that we meet along the way. Like, there's just so much more happening there.
Well, and I think, honestly, what should have signaled that people weren't going to receive this in the way in which I think they would have, like something like Saving Private Ryan, which, obviously people received very well in 1997. Dunkirk actually signaled how people are going to react to 1917, because people were ho-hum about Dunkirk in a way that made me really angry and went, this is why we don't get to have nice things, because this is a technical achievement. This is the most beautifully shot war film. Because people are like, man, they don't focus on one character solely. And it was like, are you serious? This is your actual problem with this? You don't feel just sympathy because these are people putting their lives on the line? I don't understand where your empathy is. Like, and then when 1917 comes out, and I think, like, you're using the term gimmick because I think that's the criticism. But I think the thing is if you only take the filmmaking style and saying this is all this movie is, you're missing something. I would say there is actually more to Gravity than how well it's shot. I don't think it has the most captivating story. I agree with you there. Boyhood, to me, I understand it's a remarkable achievement because of how much time it took, but I also know that there are a lot of films that take that much time to get made, so I don't know that I feel this incredible, like, I don't marvel at it. I won't deny what it did, but I don't marvel at it either. Whereas something like 1917, it's like, yes, of course, the thing we're going to talk about is how it was shot, but there's more happening there than just how it was shot. Like, and obviously, I don't understand why we have to look at that as necessarily a bad thing, or why we have to play it off like that's not something remarkable that happened. The other film, though, that I know we both love of his is a real left turn here. Yeah. And it's a movie called Away We Go. This stars Maya Rudolph and John Krasinski. It is about a young married couple who are expecting a child and decide to kind of go on a road trip to decide where they're going to raise their family. Yeah. I don't know if I can describe it more beyond that, because my recommendation is, I don't want to spoil anything. Please just watch it. It is so heartfelt.
It's beautiful. It's a beautiful movie.
It really is. Like,
heartfelt's a good word for
honestly, the themes that you believe that they're trying to ascertain in American Beauty, I think are actually ascertained in this. Like, about living life to our fullest, like deciding what our family is, deciding what we want to be, and just pursue that, pursuing our passions and our desires, and not sacrificing so that way we conform. Like, Away We Go actually does those things. And it's not cynical and it's not dark. There are parts of this movie that are heavy, but heavy in the way in which we're all going through our own little traumas, and it's about how we pursue beyond those traumas, how we find our way out, how we find our ways to heal, and that's at the heart of that film.
Yeah, I highly recommend it. That's our Tossi's take.
Yeah,
Most
actually,
people have probably never seen this movie, and
no.
our Tossi's take is go see Away We Go. By far our favorite Sam Mendes movie. I agree everything that you're saying. I think it hits all of those themes, all of that heart. I mean, it's a movie that you and I sat with a poster on our wall for years. Just highly recommend it. John Krasinski's best work. Maya Rudolph is fantastic. It's very soft compared to other Mendes's work that we're all talking about here. Nothing's over the top, just a really just beautiful, like you said, heartfelt movie. I think it's highly recommend it. Definitely our favorite.
Incredible soundtrack too.
Oh yeah, thank you. Yes, definitely.
Yeah. So with that, this is a weird thing to do with this kind of a film, but we always talk about prequel, sequel, remake, reboot. Are you giving it any of these? And if so, which?
Yes, I think...
Talking about American Beauty, pivoting back, talking about American Beauty.
I would remake it.
Okay.
I think it has the bones to be a really good movie. I'm going to say something that's going to sound like I'm making a joke, and I'm actually being serious. I could actually see Tim Burton. If Tim Burton ever wanted to just get out of, and do something a little different,
sure,
but still within his wheelhouse, I could see him making a film of, taking this script and really, and maybe you were talking about Edward Scissorhands, and maybe that's not far off. So when you brought that up, that's probably a good, comparison. I wouldn't mind. If this movie was ever remade, I think somebody reworks that script and, takes the bones of it, maybe. I don't know. It doesn't play well in 2022. You're going to have to change a lot, but what I think really is, other than I'm going off book of our, kind of category, to me it's a stage production. It plays it should be a play. I think when Alan Ball originally visualized it for that and started to write it for that, and to me it makes complete sense. You and I saw with our friends Holly and Joe years ago a play called Roulette, which has the same kind of feel with it, and I could totally picture this as a really great stage production.
Well, think about it as like a Schenectady, New York, like the Charlie Kaufman film, like that's kind of what this probably should have mirrored itself more off of. No, all right, granted, Schenectady, New York comes out in 2008, but I see what you're saying actually about this stage production idea.
A lot more Charlie Kaufman on this
than I ever would have expected this episode. But I also think that what you're throwing out there is that dialogue hits differently in a stage production. How a lot of that is handled probably feels less forceful. You probably don't have narration. When you finally get to that dinner sequence, that has to feel like the fulfillment when he throws the plate. That has to feel like the fulfillment of this tension that you've been sitting in a theater for a while. I'm not even going to offer whatever version of it I thought. I think I was thinking of not a prequel, but a changing of perspective where we tell it from Wes Bentley's point of view. Because you had brought this up, he seems to be the most redeemable or not redeemable, but interesting character in the film. What if the story was told from his perspective fully, or told through the found footage that he had in the house? If it was you just essentially release the Wes Bentley cut, and it's essentially just his footage. But honestly, even at that, I see this. I think you have hit exactly where this should have been. This should have been a stage production.
All right, yeah. So there you go. Guys should, and you have the perfect director to go back and do it.
Yes, you really do. So if you're not currently following us on social media, you can get updates at How Could You Podcast on Instagram, at How Could You Pod on Twitter. We love hearing from you via our email address, howcouldyoupodcast@gmail.com. So although 1999 disappointed with Best Picture, in the year 2000, a film that comes out that I think should have been nominated for Best Picture, which is Almost Famous. And I bring this up because that is the next film in our Nostalgia Cinema series that's going to be on March 26th at 1 p.m. This is actually going to not be in Theater 514, but across the street in the Civic Theater. So that big, beautiful, historic theater is going to be all ours to, sing Tiny Dancer with all of you. It's going to be a really magical time. It's all happening, so please come out and see that.
And until next time, look for those bags floating in the wind while you enjoy so much beauty, and enjoy the Odyssey.